Welcome everybody to the second day 2 of the Second Chances Symposium. This is the panel on state and federal clemency, past and future. My name is Judith Miller. I'm a former federal defender, and I now teach in the Federal Criminal Justice Clinic here at the University of Chicago Law School. Just to start us off, a couple of housekeeping reminders in case you missed them the first few times. Attorneys, if you need CLE credit, Kyla Norcross is going to put the MCLE code for this session in the chat partway through the panel, so keep a lookout for that. In addition, everyone, please make sure to ask questions in the Q&A and not in the chat, and someone will try to answer them or we'll pose them to the panel. So before I introduce our panelists, who are amazing, I do just want to zoom out for a moment. Yesterday, we heard a lot about the urgent need for second look sentencing. The panelists underscored the need to create and use a variety of different methods for revisiting sentences. So they talked about how second look sentencing serves individuals who should not be in prison any longer, or perhaps should never have been in prison for as long as they were sentenced to. And it serves systemic purposes as society changes our understanding of what the criminal system is for. We should not leave anyone behind. So this panel is about clemency in particular, which we haven't discussed all that much yet. And so in case folks are unfamiliar, I thought I would just define a couple of terms. First of all, the term commutation is a form of clemency, which usually means reducing or modifying the sentence of someone who is currently imprisoned. That's, it can include things like reducing a sentence to time served or modifying a sentence from a death penalty sentence to something else. A pardon can essentially erases the conviction altogether. Those decisions can be purely discretionary, like in the federal system, something it's formally just up to the president with no formal restrictions. Or many states have a board that plays a role in clemency decisions to a greater or lesser degree. I will say, and it's sort of ironic for me to be moderating this panel, that when I was a federal defender, I was not so big on clemency. I thought that clemency was essentially just a political feel-good story, a way for politicians to paper over the brutality and horror of the criminal system by setting free one perfect person. That it required telling a redemption story and had nothing to offer the person who just shouldn't have been sentenced in the first place to 10 years, 15 years, or a lifetime in prison, regardless of whether they were a saint or not. But as the panelists today will show, that was wrong, or at least it can be wrong. Clemency does, of course, offer a chance for extraordinary individuals. I had the opportunity to represent one such person under the Obama Clemency Initiative. But as the panelists will discuss, it can also offer broader opportunities, including a more systemic approach to changing the criminal system. It can. And it also relates to other forms of second look advocacy, things we've talked about before in previous panels and that future panels will also discuss. So we've been asked by Erica and Jenny, all panelists have been asked to say, what does second look mean to them? And I will say that for me, what second look means to me is the fight. The fighters are our clients, people who never had a first chance, in Ronaldo Hudson's words last night. It's a second look and sometimes a first chance. Too many times, it takes a third look, a fourth look, a fifth look. It can take many looks to get to that first chance. And I'm inspired by my colleagues, people like Erica and Jenny, who fight multiple avenues of second looks or third looks, many looks at the same time. To me, second look means saying, I don't accept this unjust result, and I will fight and fight and fight and fight some more to try to change that. So I want to introduce our panelists today, who are fighters to the bone. First, Shanna Rifkin, who serves as Deputy General Counsel for Families Against Mandatory Minimums. As Erica described yesterday, we are all working in the shadow of FAMM's leadership on sentencing reform. Shanna came to FAMM from the Northwestern Law School's Children and Family Justice Center, where she fought for clemency on behalf of incarcerated youth in Illinois. And if you look up any of Shanna's biographies online, you will always see them mention how much she loved her federal clerkships in the Western District of New York and the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and how they helped form her understanding of this work. And I mention that in part because it connects to me personally, where I changed my career trajectory as well to become a public defender after what I saw while clerking. Shanna is also a graduate of Duke Law School. Second, we have Mike Romano, who's founder and director of the Three Strikes and Justice Advocacy Project at Stanford Law School. He's also currently the chair of the California Committee on Revision of the Penal Code, which is a mouthful for a committee that proposed and developed 6 California laws that will shorten thousands of sentences at the front end and at the back end. Before that, he co-authored and helped pass several statewide second look ballot initiatives to walk back California's draconian 3 strikes laws. And he also founded the Ride Home Prisoner Reentry Program, which partnered with the Obama administration's Clemency Initiative. In 2016, he was recognized by the White House as a champion of change for this work. And in addition to this systemic change work, Mike, his students, and his colleagues, including his deputy director, Susan Champion, and staff attorneys Milena Blake and Lara Hoffman, also represent individual clients and have litigated the reversals of over 150 life sentences. A few years back, I was lucky enough to work directly for Mike and his colleagues for about 6 months, and their fierce dedication to their work inspires me to this day. Third, we have Mark Osler, who is a professor and the Robert and Marion Short Distinguished Chair in Law at the University of St. Thomas School of Law. He's one of the leading scholar advocates in the world of clemency. In 2011, he founded the first legal clinic specializing in federal commutations. And in 2015, he founded a 1-year pop-up law firm, the Clemency Resource Center, with Rachel Barkow. Between the 2 projects, over 100 people have been released from prison. A former federal prosecutor, he also played a role in striking down the mandatory 100-to-1 ratio between crack and powder cocaine in the federal sentencing guidelines. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that Mark is also highly decorated for his teaching. The law school graduating classes of 2016 and 2019 selected him as Professor of the Year. And in 2013, he received his law school's Outstanding Teaching Award. Now, the goal of this panel is to provide an overview of what's happening with clemency at the state and federal level, to focus on problems, but also to highlight bright spots. Our panelists bring a variety of different perspectives to this work. I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. With that, Shanna, why don't you start us off with your introductory remarks?
Hey, thank you so much. First off, it's a true honor to be here and speak among so many people that I have long admired. It really is a pinch yourself moment for me. And I love that the symposium was kicked off with the request that we all share our view on what second chances means. I think hearing everyone's view is inspiring and also validating that we all agree on the end goal. And so the question now is, how do we get there? So I want to start with what second chances means to me. Second chances for me is really the power of conversation. It's the power of storytelling. And it's a necessary reminder for me that othering is a product of fear and it's rooted in racism. I think, Judith mentioned the impact of my clerkships, and she's right. During my time in district court, the question that was often asked was what? What did you do? What were the circumstances? What are the charges? What is the evidence? But until you're sentenced, no one really asks why. And if they do, they don't often listen to the answer. So I think why is one of the most powerful questions if you're willing to listen to the answer. And I think the problem that we as a society have is that the answer to why is often so much more difficult to process than the answer to what. The what can be construed as a fact, but the why often invokes trauma and vulnerability, and it makes us uncomfortable. But to me, that's exactly why second chances and second look laws are important. At a time when we're so isolated from each other, asking why and really listening to the answer is an incredible force for connecting and understanding and moving the needle. Yesterday, there was a lot of discussion about legislative actions to release people from prison, compassionate release, medical parole. And as Judith said, this panel is really going to focus on clemency. I was asked to sort of sketch out the landscape of clemency and set the background. So I'll define some of the terms again. Judith already defined some of them, but in case some of you are late, I'll set a little bit of the ground for what this is. So clemency at the federal level is a constitutional power. It's under Article 2, Section 2, and state constitutions often mimic the federal constitution. And we see that with clemency as well, where states often have their clemency power in their state constitution. The power to pardon, though, actually dates back to medieval times. It's a vestige of this monarchy, of the all-powerful being. And I think that that's actually quite interesting because our founding fathers, who were terrified of recreating a monarchy in this new world, still included in the US Constitution the pardon power. And in an attempt to sort of reckon that, the United States Supreme Court in Biddle versus Perovich observed that, quote, a pardon in our days is not a private act of grace from an individual happening to possess power. It is part of the constitutional scheme. When granted, it is the determination of the ultimate authority that the public welfare will be better served by inflicting less than what the judgment fixed. End of the quote. One of the things that I really love about this quote is that it suggests that pardoning people in clemency is really an act of pragmatism. It doesn't reflect the pardoner's omniscience, but rather it's an efficient way to correct an overcorrection. And in the federal system, clemency is a critical tool to support second chances and get people out of prison. Federal parole was abolished, and so the right to attack your conviction or sentence is strictly limited. And many people waive their right to appeal on plea agreements. So that might suggest that this power is frequently invoked. It's a function of the Constitution, after all. Although commutations were granted pretty regularly up until the 1980s, they really decreased from the 80s until the Obama years. Likely because of the war on drugs and crime rates. But President Obama granted over 1,700 commutations and 212 pardons. And again, Judith said this at the beginning, but just to clarify, a commutation shortens someone's sentence and a pardon voids a conviction. So far, President Biden has granted zero at all. So in short, things are not trending in a positive way right now. And I think if history tells us something, it's likely because crime is an issue that people are concerned about right now. And we also have an election season coming up. Even, as we look at the states, the state governors, even governors like Governor Pritzker of Illinois, who had been pretty tremendous on clemency for quite some time, has really slowed down. At FAMM, we are looking at trends across the country, and we've seen more stories recently in the news of backlash against governors who had used their clemency power with more regularity. Because of the general fear-mongering about crime in the upcoming election season, I think elected officials are acting out of fear above all else. And to me, this is really just such a marketing issue. It's so easy to craft a salacious story of governor approves release of person who committed enter horrible crime. That scares some people. But let's counter those stories by telling the stories of our clients, of our members, and the people who we all know who have been given a second chance, the people who inspire our work. FAMM's main tool in political advocacy, in clemency, and in second chances is to change hearts and minds by using stories, and it works. I think the other thing that is helpful in an election season is to publicly thank governors who have reunified families and bettered our communities by returning people home as a way to counter that dangerous narrative that often gets told in the news. So to kind of circle back to the quote from the Supreme Court, sometimes clemency feels extraordinary. And I think that's because it seems like it's bypassing this entire system. But I actually think that advocates' job might be to demonstrate that it really isn't this extraordinary act from a person in power. A person doesn't need to be an angel to be worthy of a second look. We as a society need to be willing to say, hey, we overcriminalize something or someone, and now we know better. This pragmatic approach to clemency has been done before, and I would like to see this become a trend. Thanks again so much for having me, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Shanna. Mike, do you want to take up your remarks, your introductory remarks?
Judith and everyone in Chicago, thank you so much for having me. Judith, it's great to see you. I miss working with you every day. Shanna and Mark, it's good to see you too. And while I'm going to talk about some of the shortcomings related to clemency, at least in my mind, I'm a huge fan of your work. And I agree with I think we're all on the same page, and we agree that we're looking for the same end goal, which is to reduce over-incarceration. So I'll begin a bit. I was asked to begin with a bit about the Obama Clemency Initiative, known as Clemency Project 2014, and then talk about why I think while clemency is an important executive power, it's not a terrific strategy for solving the broader policy failure of over-incarceration. So in April of 2014, then Deputy Attorney General under President Obama, James Cole, announced that the president would begin a massive clemency effort to shorten prison terms for certain people sentenced to nonviolent federal drug crimes. After months of negotiations and planning, eligibility criteria were set and a review process was put in place by DOJ and the White House. Defense counsel were organized by the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, among others, present company included. And our program was involved, and Mark was involved, Judith was involved, and we were especially involved in the area of reentry, which I'm happy to discuss later. We're proud of our contribution, but we were hardly the primary movers. By the end of the initiative, which continued up to the very last days of President Obama's tenure, over 1,700 people were freed from prison. Many were serving life without parole sentences, and it was really an unprecedented accomplishment. By comparison, I think these numbers are correct. George W. Bush granted clemency to 11 people during his presidency, President Clinton 61, and President H.W. Bush just 3. Still, many people saw the Obama clemency effort as a tremendous missed opportunity, sabotaged by career prosecutors and DOJ and bureaucratic incompetence. The pardon attorney at the time, Deborah Leff, quit. The Washington Post described the project as mired in conflict. And I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of frustration and disappointment, especially among hopeful prisoners, their families, and advocates. Based in part on this experience, I argue that executive clemency is an important and meaningful tool, but it cannot and should not be a primary weapon in the fight against mass incarceration. I have 3 reasons why. First, clemency is a black box. We really don't know why people are selected or rejected for clemency, and people outside of the executive decision-making process, defense lawyers, advocates, incarcerated people themselves, their families, have no opportunities to explain or litigate their case for release. As a result, the process feels arbitrary. There are no real standards. There are no appeals. There's no due process. Next, clemency is too political. As Shanna alluded to, presidents and governors are the highest profile politicians and just don't like signing their names to early prisoner release orders. Even in the most liberal of jurisdictions, early release can be seen mainly as a liability. Sometimes this is, or I call this the Willie Horton effect, which is also compounded by the opposite effect from Bill Clinton's experience with Ricky Rector, and I'm happy to go into that whole history as well. But in any event, the point remains that I think that politicians are, especially governors and presidents, are very politically sensitive, and clemency is mainly seen as a political liability. Third, even under the best circumstances, there's a tremendous bottleneck associated with clemency. The power belongs to the executive, the president or governor, and all decision-making information needs to be funneled to a single person. With so many thousands, tens of thousands, millions of lives at stake, clemency is just insufficiently scalable. This, I think, was the main problem with the Obama clemency effort at the end of the day. So here's what I propose instead. In my mind, legislation, primarily second look laws, are far more effective at addressing the problem of mass incarceration. Perhaps the most obvious example is the First Step Act of 2018, which resulted in the release of over 4,000 federal inmates, more than twice as many as released under President Obama's clemency program in a shorter period of time. Another second look law was the retroactive application of drug reform laws known as Drugs -2, which sent thousands of people back to court for reduced sentences, and over 30,000 sentences were reduced in the first 18 months of the program. In California, as Judith alluded to, we've had voter-approved laws that have given similar second looks to all people incarcerated for nonviolent crimes, including the release of over 15,000 people, including thousands of people serving life sentences under California's 3 strikes law. In all these circumstances, in both federal and California, there was transparency and due process. Standards were set in law or regulation. Cases were presented in courts all across the country, thus scalability, in public, with defense counsel and prosecutors arguing the merits of each case. More importantly, far more people deserving of early release were freed from prison under these laws compared to those granted executive clemency. Best of all, these laws are already on the books. In California, the Department of Corrections can recommend reduced sentences for people whose incarceration is no longer in the interests of justice, and over 2,000 petitions have already been filed in trial courts throughout the state in just over a year. The Federal Bureau of Prisons has the same authority. It can send cases back to court for sentencing reconsideration, where the merits of a reduced sentences can be litigated in open court and decided upon by a judge with life tenure, thus reducing the Willie Horton effect. I want to reiterate that clemency, of course, remains an important tool. It can even out disparities should second look reviews vary by geography or race or other inappropriate factors. I know personally many people who are free and thriving and no longer behind bars because of clemency, and I am deeply, deeply happy for them. However, despite its value, I worry that high-profile clemency campaigns divert attention from other legislative and regulatory reforms that can have far greater impact toward long-term goal of reducing unnecessary, unfair, brutal, racist, and counterproductive over-incarceration. I look forward to hearing from everybody. I don't mean to throw cold water on the idea, but because I really do think that there's a lot of grace and it's an important tool, but I just don't think it's an effective long-term political strategy.
Well, thank you for those remarks. Mark, would you like to give your remarks? I know you have some things to say about that.
I do, in fact. And first of all, though, it's really important to thank you all for organizing this. It's been too long, and it's so sad that we can't be there in person. I really regret not getting to meet some of my heroes who would have been there: Len Goodman, Jennifer Sobel, Steve Zeidman. And I also want to recognize that a lot of our work here and the fact that we know each other rests on top of the work of Nkechi Taifa, who brought a lot of us together during the Obama administration for the work that was done then. One thing, I think sometimes there's a fundamental misunderstanding when we talk about clemency the way it is right now. Clemency isn't a reform of the criminal justice system. That's not what it is. It's a unique part of the criminal justice system. It's a component of what already exists that needs to be reformed. It's been there from the start. It's in the Constitution. And since the Constitution was written, it's been used wisely and it's been used foolishly. But it's always been there. We need to fix it. Most of you have heard me talk about this ad nauseum, and I'm not going to go through all of it again, but the system doesn't work because of conflicts of interest. It's embedded in the Department of Justice, and because of bureaucracy. And there have been some real heroes who have done great work to try to undo that. You mentioned Deborah Leff, and she's one of those people. Many mechanisms work together to create mass incarceration. And it's going to take many mechanisms to undo it working together. Compassionate release is one of those. And we heard yesterday from another one of my heroes, Mary Price, who's done remarkable work making compassionate release work. And it's been pushing a large boulder uphill to do that. Clemency has the potential to also be one of those tools. It's going to take unity of all of us to make change, the same way it took unity, bipartisan work to create the problem in the first place. But I think that's possible. I mean, this isn't women's figure skating or something. Clemency is unique among second chance mechanisms. And I want to talk about some of the reasons that that's true. First of all, breadth and potential. That clemency is unique and that it can be used broadly or narrowly at the discretion of the president. We saw Presidents Ford and Carter work to bring the country back together after Vietnam by pardoning and then granting amnesty to tens of thousands of people who'd deserted from the Army, hadn't reported for the draft. And that was a successful effort. And then you've got the grants that go to a single person or a small group of people. Many of us know Jason Hernandez, one of 8 people, just 8, that President Obama commuted in 2013. And this is one tool that can do both those things if we can convince the decider to do so. The other thing too, and Mike, you mentioned this, is that the second chance mechanisms that go back to judges can create terrible disparities and already have. The Sentencing Commission has released a report on compassionate release in calendar years 2020 and 2021. And this is after the First Step Act, obviously. And we don't know what interjudge disparities are within a district. I suspect they're pretty severe. We know between districts how severe they've become. For example, in the Western District of Kentucky, of North Carolina, Western District of North Carolina, there were 479 compassionate release cases filed, and only 13 of them were granted, 2.7%. Meanwhile, in the District of Oregon, it was over 64%. And of course, those are on opposite ends of the country. So let's look at Georgia. In Georgia, in the Middle District of Georgia, 2.1% of compassionate release petitions were granted. And in the Northern District of Georgia, adjacent to the Middle District, it was 44%, almost half. And so when we have these kinds of disparities, which are inherent in a system that sends things back to a judge, there has to be another mechanism that's able to even things out. And that can be clemency if it's chosen to be used that way. And, you know, one of the things too about these disparities that is masked really is that the judges who are harshest in the first place are the ones who are also most reluctant to grant clemency or grant a second chance down the road. Meanwhile, the people who weren't sentenced too harshly in the first place are going to be sent back to the judge most likely to consider compassionate release. So it's reifying existing disparities amongst judges. Now, I think compassionate release is really important. This isn't an argument against compassionate release. It's an argument for finding a mechanism that can even that out. And that could be clemency. Third, pardons. One thing that no other second chance mechanism that we're talking about, some would say expungement, we don't have that in the federal system, but will do what pardons do. You know, they give people their rights back after they've served their term. And it's too often dismissed, but can be really important. It's a return of full citizenship or human dignity. Mike mentioned that George W. Bush granted 11 clemencies. I think he meant commutations. He granted 189 pardons, and those can be significant. I always go to the pardon hearings here in Minnesota, and people here make their case directly to the governor and the attorney general and the chief justice in person, and then they decide on the fly. It's quite a hearing. And to hear people make their case for a pardon, saying that they want to hunt with their grandchildren, it's really something. Fourth, value signaling, that clemency is unique in the ability to signal values, good and bad. I mean, Trump signaled values through clemency, and that wasn't great. But George Washington, in pardoning the leaders of the Whiskey Rebellion, did something different. When President Obama visited people in prison and then entered into the Clemency Initiative, that certainly sent a message about values. And my friend Jason Hernandez made a point that has really stuck with me, which is that clemency offers a way for forgiveness to go both ways, and also contrition, because people who are seeking a commutation, that's part of it. But the government needs to seek redemption too for the mistakes that have been made, and clemency offers that. Fifth, clemency, if we reform it, would allow to get around the obstruction of the Department of Justice. Right now, that's the problem with a lot of these things. And when we send things back to courts, we're always going to have DOJ involvement. But clemency, if we reform it, would be out of the DOJ, would allow a way around that. I'd note that there's a bill in Congress right now, the Fixed Clemency Act, that would do exactly that. And of course, the president could choose to do it on his own. 6, review of clemency can humanize the criminal justice system for the president. That idea of President Obama carrying files to the residents at the end of the day and reading the stories of people who are in prison, I think that was deeply humanizing. Here in Minnesota, when the governor interacts with pardon seekers, that's an engagement with a part of the population that probably he wouldn't hear their story any other way. And it's important that the executive does. And finally, clemency is a principal constitutional duty of the president. You know, we can say it's not being used enough. That's certainly true. Or it's used the wrong way. Absolutely true as well. But it is a duty, and we have an obligation to press the president to use it in the right way. The Constitution contains some things that are just awful, the 3/5 compromise, and the really elegant things too. But few powers in the Constitution match the pardon power's rootedness in a deep and commonly held principle, which is the virtue of mercy. And just to close, I mean, mass incarceration, again, was created by many mechanisms working at once, and reversing it is going to take the same thing. No one measure is sufficient, and clemency has an important role to play. Thank you.
Wow, there's so much there. I'm going to jump off a couple of things that Mark and Mike mentioned. Mark, you mentioned, and I know you've written about this, the role of bureaucracy in the Department of Justice as one of the problems in making clemency a more effective tool for addressing mass incarceration. And Mike, you pointed to scalability as a potential issue, or as not just a potential issue, an actual issue. And so to the two of you, I guess I would ask, why do you think that federal clemency, which I guess I'll make the judgment and say, at least right now, is broken. Why do you think federal clemency faces so many problems? And on the flip side of that, when do you think it has been successful and why? Maybe Mark, do you want to start us off, and then we'll go to Mike?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for asking that question. I'm a former federal prosecutor, so I have an insight into this, which is, put yourself in the feet of a prosecutor. You're asking at sentencing that someone's life be taken away from them. In Texas, literally, someone who's standing 12 feet away from you. There's an emotional investment in that that's really deep. And that means it's very hard for prosecutors to, in a way, admit that was wrong, that investment that they made in incarcerating someone for such a length was wrong. And the problem with the system is it's enmeshed within the Department of Justice. When Rachel Barco and I were writing an article called "Designed to Fail: The President's Deference to the Department of Justice," one of the things we came across was a response that a U.S. attorney had made to a clemency petition. And this was a clemency petition for someone who was wildly qualified for it, someone who had done the work, who had been in prison for decades, who had a drug offense that was long ago in his past and had done really remarkable things in prison. And despite all that, this is the response that the U.S. attorney had when asked by the pardon attorney for an opinion. The clemency application details what appears to be a remarkable turnaround during his time in custody. I cannot offer any insight into the representations about his progress, nor can I be of much assistance in evaluating whether the changes, if true, warrant clemency. Jailhouse conversions are not uncommon, and I have no tools or experience with which to evaluate which ones are genuine or may endure beyond the confines of imprisonment. And recommended denial of clemency, and it was denied. That's the mindset that we're dealing with. Now, Judith, you asked, okay, when has it been used well? When President Ford used it and President Carter, back in the Vietnam era, they both went around DOJ. President Ford created a commission that was outside of the DOJ, and they took a political risk in doing this. One of the things that I find really stunning in our current political context is both President Ford and President Carter announced their initiatives at a conference of the VFW. I mean, they went to the most hostile audience they could because they felt the duty to explain to them what they were doing. I mean, Carter was booed and the audience had to be gavelled down when he announced the amnesty program. But he did that and it worked and it was successful. And that's the kind of political bravery to consider something other than just sending things through the DOJ again and again that we just don't see right now. And we can look for, hopefully, in our next president.
So I in some ways, I agree with Mark. I think that the problems using the DOJ or prosecutors in the clemency process creates the problem, and was certainly a big problem in the Obama clemency program. But I just don't see a way around it, honestly, given the politics of these are political creatures of the highest order. And the reason why governors and presidents rely on prosecutors is for political cover. So they can say, if somebody gets out and does something, it gets in the newspapers. Well, I followed the advice of law enforcement officers. It wasn't my decision. And I mean, I think that if you asked any president in our lifetimes, any policy that was supported by Presidents Ford and Carter, like that would just go to say, yeah, precisely. They were political failures. So I really think that given the political sensitivities of these people in our times, I would be shocked if a large scale clemency effort in any state or federal government would go outside without consultation of prosecutors. And in my personal experience, relying on judges and sending cases back to judges is far more effective. Although imperfect, most are former prosecutors themselves, so you're not getting around the problem altogether. But I just think the political realities, it's very difficult to avoid the problem of having prosecutors at the heart of the clemency process.
Just to follow up quickly on that, I think we've come close actually in the last decade. That in the Trump administration in September of 2018, there was a meeting in the White House where they seemed close to adopting a system that would be outside of DOJ. And part of it was because President Trump was really mad at AG Sessions and distance from the DOJ. And before the last election, Nkechi Taifa, Rachel Barco, and I approached the Democratic primary contenders. And every major contender except Biden made a pledge to take the process out of DOJ and create an independent board. And so I do think that the political will is there. And we've had a couple unlucky breaks. And frankly, in terms of this, Biden was probably the least positive person we could have ended up having in office.
Thank you. So I think, you both raised politics and the political clemency in the political context. And Shanna, I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about how clemency works as a political issue, especially during elections. I'm thinking of the remarks that Mark and Mike both made, and also the kind of the perfect clemency candidate problem, and how that can exclude some of the bigger picture and the broader group of people who deserve a second look, but may not be perfect, like all of us who are imperfect. So how can we use clemency is there a way to use clemency in politics without falling into the one perfect candidate narrative?
Yeah, so I think, clemency can be a double-edged sword, right? I mean, you're talking about the idea of it is inherently political. We're asking political figures to do something, to use their power to free people. And I think you're right that when we tell stories, in my mind, storytelling and getting the narrative out about what clemency actually looks like, who we're granting clemency to, why we're granting clemency to those people, is a really important political tool that we can use. And as advocates, I think it's our job to organize around that, to convince political figures that, we have these drug laws. For example, in Colorado, the governor granted mass clemency to a group of people who were convicted of drug laws when the state changed their drug laws. That is how clemency should be used. And that is an appropriate, that's a great way to use clemency as a political tool. I think something that makes me nervous about clemency is, the inertia that kind of comes up in election years. And I think that's something that we're seeing right now. So things kind of screech to a halt when there is an election. And I've been trying to think about, well, how do we overcome that? Because then you have these people whose, petitions are pending and they stay pending. And it's really hard to get those wheels moving again. But I think it is our job to keep pushing those narratives and to keep pushing the stories of successful, of how people are impacting communities in a positive way. doesn't mean telling this person is an angel. It just means saying, like, it matters to our community to have people back in this community, and you have the power to affect that by using by using the power that's granted to you under the Constitution. It is, I have a client who is currently, his application is currently pending before Governor Pritzker. And it makes me nervous. It makes me sad that right now, because of all of the backlash that governors have been getting, they are slowing down and almost bringing to a halt what they had been doing before. And so hopefully all of the bright minds at this panel, this panel and all of the panels in these 2 days, can think about ways that we can use our political power to convince governors and the president that clemency is a political risk, but it's a political risk worth taking. It's a political risk that they have to take, and hopefully they will.
So I want to follow up on one thing you mentioned. You referred to that you spoke about the mass clemency in Colorado when the drug laws changed. And I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about some of the bright spots among the states where clemency has been used effectively as a tool for making more significant changes in the criminal system.
Yeah, sure. So we've recently seen in Oregon, the governor in Oregon has been granting, I think she granted 72 clemencies to people who were convicted of crimes when they were juveniles. And so that is another great example of saying, as a society, we don't think that these young people should have been sentenced this harshly. So let's take them as a group. We don't have to say, well, this person has shown all of the substantial reform. We can just say, we don't think that this was the right thing for us to do, and we can correct that wrong. So I think that's a great example of someone who has done that. I also think, your motivation, the motivations for granting clemency can be really, personal. I mean, think about Governor Huckabee, who was, he's conservative, but he was a person of faith. And he said that as a person of faith, it is critical to show mercy. And so he took that upon himself and granted mass clemencies in that state. And he was, I think that's also an example of how you can use your motivation as a shield. So who's going to come and say and attack his faith, right? I mean, his faith was a motivating factor for him, and his faith could also be a shield for political backlash. But I think that politicians have to be willing to stand out there and say, this was my motivation and I stand by it.
To follow up on that, I guess I would ask, what do you think, maybe to you and to Mark, what do you think the federal government can learn from some of these successes at the state? I realize they have not all been successes, but there have been successes at the states. I think it's really striking that the Biden administration has failed to grant even one clemency petition, even for someone who did not campaign on clemency in the way, did not make those pre-election agreements or commitments that some of the other Democratic candidates might have made. This has really just been a strikingly terrible record. Zero is hard to get around. So I guess I would ask, what's, in a sense, what's going on, if and what's the status of federal clemency right now? Is there something we can learn from the states? And is there something we should take away from this, or is it just bad luck?
I was just going to say that Mark had mentioned the Obama, I think Obama looking at drug offenses and saying, society has moved and progressed in this way. I mean, he looked at drug offenses as a class. And that is in many ways what we see going on in the states. When we think about the governor of Oregon, we think about Governor Huckabee and the former governor of Colorado. I think that the Biden administration had an idea for something called expedited clemency, where they were going to propose a certain class of people. And that was people who had been convicted of drug crimes, were released to home confinement under the CARES Act, and have 4 years or less on their sentences. And unfortunately, at FAMM, we work directly, we hear directly from people. And there are a lot of people who were told, hey, this thing is coming, you should get your application ready. Send your application into the pardon office. Those people have heard absolutely nothing. And that is really, it's a tragedy for those people to get your hopes up, to think that something is coming and then to hear nothing. So I don't I don't know what's going on at the White House. Mark may have a better sense of that than I do, but I know that it is affecting real people. It is, I mean, it is a tragedy to get people's hopes up, to think that they are going to be on an expedited path to clemency and then to leave them in the lurch.
Judith, you mentioned that the administration has failed to grant any clemencies at all so far. And, in the last few administrations, we've seen the same thing. What's really striking is that President Biden hasn't denied any either. They've just ignored the whole thing. And so, I mean, the other administrations, sure, they didn't grant early, but they denied some, at least, by presidential action. And that's what we're seeing here is they're just not dealing with it. There's something that's stuck. And we see this in other areas too. I mean, we haven't had a sentencing commission since 2018. We're all still working with the 2018 sentencing guidelines. They haven't gotten their act together to come up with names to put forward for the sentencing commission. So there is something stuck in the White House counsel's office that they're just not getting the basic blocking and tackling done. You can make political excuses for not granting petitions early. I disagree with them, but not denying them doesn't make any sense at all, especially when you've got a historic backlog of over 18,000 petitions sitting there, many of them 5 and 6 years old, dating all the way back to the Obama administration. So I think that's a part of it. Now, what to learn from the states? There's a lot to learn from the states. And a big one is don't be so scared. I mean, when you've got Governor Stitt in Oklahoma doing hundreds of grants and not suffering apparent political disaster. And Shanna, you mentioned Mike Huckabee, and he did do all those clemencies, but you know what? One of them went terribly wrong. One of the people he granted clemency to went out to Washington State, I believe, and killed 4 people. And yet it didn't destroy his reputation, even when the worst possible thing happened. This Willie Horton memory that haunts clemency, it's not a current political reality, that they don't have to be so timid, and to see the fact that you can be bold with clemency and not be dragged down, they just need to look at these states.
So that's a great segue into something that is kind of clemency related. Mike, I want to ask you, I know California is just such an exciting place right now for second look reforms. And I suppose also first look before someone is sentenced in the first place. Given your involvement with that, I'm hoping you can tell us more about clemency's state level reforms about second look and even first look. What's been successful? What could use improvement? And what can states or the federal government with less reform-minded politics take away from the California experience?
Well, I think the first thing to learn is that California has reduced its prison population by about 25% over the past 10 years and reduced crime rates at the same time, right? So in terms of overall public safety, we can dramatically reduce the number of people behind bars and improve public safety at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive of each other. And I think politicians need to change that. And we need to change the political dynamic from one being of potential risk to opportunity, right? That this is something that people want. And I really do think that voters overwhelmingly really support criminal justice reform broadly. Every public opinion poll I've seen shows that voters are far more progressive on these issues than elected officials. They don't have their jobs at stake, which is part of the reason. And voters are not in it, and they're in it for the right reasons. They're not in it to save money, but they really understand that sentences are just too darn long and counterproductive to public safety. So I think and hope that both in the federal level and other states can realize that you can have a massive decarceration effort largely through second look, various different laws and regulations, and very little clemency, and improve public safety at the same time. And that in fact, it's a way to improve communities, reunite families, and bring hope and redemption and incentivize rehabilitation. So I really do think that there can be opportunities here, and I hope that California does serve as a model.
I guess I want to circle back to a point. I think we've talked about politics, and we've referred and the fact that clemency at the federal level is in the Constitution, is one of the presidential duties. And I want to go back to the Trump years for a moment, if I may. And there was a lot of criticism of this, what some people call the politicization of clemency during the Trump years. Sometimes that favored us. Sometimes there was some advocacy around the criminal system, as in Kim Kardashian's high-profile work. Other times, it really seemed like little more than corruption and cronyism. Mark, I guess I would ask you, what do you make of this? Should clemency be reformed in some way to eliminate this political aspect? Is that even possible or desirable?
Whether it's desirable, I don't think it's possible under the Constitution. It's one of those unchecked powers, actually maybe the only unchecked power that's put right into the president's hands, and to limit that through legislation is probably going to run into challenge. Don't think people haven't thought about it. Certainly after Bill Clinton granted a pardon to Mark Rich, there was furious blowback, and Congress wanted to do something, and the consensus at that point was, well, without amending the Constitution, we're not going to be able to do that. And I think that practically that's not possible. One thing though is that the ultimate check on the pardon power is electoral politics, and with Trump, people didn't like his clemencies. Some of them were really repugnant. I'm writing a piece on this right now, and I can't do it for very long because I get too mad and I have to walk away from it and stomp around my office. And, and my students probably wonder when they look in through the window what's going on with Osler. But, he lost. He lost an election, and he didn't lose by that much. If a few others, as he as well knows, if a few states had flipped the other way, he would have won. It may be that the people that didn't like his clemency made a difference in that election. It could be that the way the system is supposed to work, that the electoral process is a check on the way a president uses clemency, that kind of worked. That said, and as angry as I get about some of the deeply cynical ways that clemency was used by Trump, even at its worst, that's one thing about clemency. Even if it's worst, it's mercy. You think about Joe Arpaio, and when he gave a pardon to Joe Arpaio, I was as mad as everybody, and I wrote an angry piece about it. I think I wrote an angry piece in Sojourners, which is not where a lot of angry pieces go. But in the end, yeah, that was awful, and it sent a terrible message. But it also meant an 85-year-old guy didn't go to jail. There's that too. That clemency, because it allows people out of prison instead of putting them in, it's not a very good tool of tyranny. And even when it's used at its worst, the way Trump did, it really didn't help him in any of his misguided goals. And I think, hopefully we've seen the worst it can be, and we're past that, and we voted that person out of office. And I think that matters.
Shanna, do you want to go ahead? Go for it.
Yeah, I have been thinking about this a lot recently, because Trump has actually been using clemency as a part of his new political, speeches that he's making. He's talking about granting pardons to people who were convicted for January 6th. And I've been thinking about that a lot, because it sort of gives rise to a lot of difficult feelings that I have, similar to what Mark was saying. I mean, on the one hand, I do think it's good for political candidates to be talking about clemency and what clemency can do. On the other hand, what's really upsetting about that is that in my mind, clemency is a tool that's used to benefit the public welfare. It's used to, like that quote said, inflict less than what the judgment what the judgment fixed. And I think in that situation, it feels wrong because it feels like those, that was a harm to the public welfare. So I think that's how I've been reckoning with what he's been saying recently about the January 6th, the people who were convicted, the offenses on January 6th. But I also want to talk about Kim Kardashian and, sort of celebrities who are getting involved in this movement, and all power to them. I mean, I'm sort of, I'm of the mindset that if you're going to help and your help is actually getting people out of prison, great, let's continue to use it. I mean, I saw some tweet where someone on the public defense Twitter had said, hey, Kim Kardashian, welcome to public defense Twitter. And I thought that, that was so funny and it was so good. I mean, she is writing stories that are getting people's attention. It is raising this as an issue and raising this consciousness in people who otherwise wouldn't have known about this. And I think what that makes me realize is that it's not that people don't care, it's that people don't know. And I think the more that people know, the more they'll care. So the more that people like Kim Kardashian or other celebrities, like John Legend has been doing a lot of this work too, want to talk about individual cases and help those people, that's great. And we should embrace that and welcome that because it is actually changing politicians' minds.
Well said. I hope that I didn't sound, frankly, I thought it was great that I agree with you about the Kim Kardashian point, just to be clear. I hope that didn't sound like I was criticizing that. It's wonderful when people get involved. But go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, just, I felt ambivalent about that at times, but I can tell you, it was bizarre. Rachel Barco and I went and sat in the Roosevelt room and made a pitch to Jared Kushner. And, there were some people there who I deeply admire, like Brittany Barnett was in the meeting. But across the table, there's Kim Kardashian. And, her photographer shows up and all of a sudden it's on her Instagram feed. But you know what? It does. That's a platform that the rest of us don't have. And when I talk to somebody and what they know about this area is through Kim Kardashian, what's more than they knew otherwise, and they care more about it and care to learn more about it. So, yeah, I guess like the others here, I've got no problem with whoever wants to join us and walk the same way and talk about what we're talking about. Welcome aboard.
I'll just add, to the extent that there's certain celebrities, as Kim, John Legend, Common, I'd just like to give a shout out to my friend Scott Budnick, who's a Hollywood producer in Los Angeles, who personally brought those people into prison in California to meet people who are incarcerated, and I think really motivated them to get involved. And to Shanna's point, that meeting these people in person is really, and knowing their stories and seeing whole people in real lives brings about change. And I think that relates back to the Kim Kardashian and celebrity story.
So shifting gears kind of dramatically from the personal and the stories, I think we have a really good question that's a little bit technical about clemency, this is from one of the people here. Do folks have an opinion about whether more transparent clemency systems are better than less transparent systems? The person who asked the question notes that they're in Colorado, where the Executive Clemency Advisory Board's meetings and recommendations to the governor, are not public. Would it be better? Is advocating for change on that a good idea? It could be healthy for the public and advocates to know, for example, whether the governor is sitting on a lot of unanimous board recommendations. But of course, there's the flip side of that. Is it possible that if these recommendations were public, that would risk negatively influencing some board members' willingness to support a grant in the first place? So I'm hoping someone with does someone want to take that?
Well, I know that here in Minnesota, we have the most transparent system you can imagine. People who have a petition, as I mentioned before, I've never seen a process like it. They appear, and then up on the podium is the governor of the state, the attorney general. So there's Keith Ellison and the chief justice of the Supreme Court. And the governor says, yes, what's your story? And they make their pitch, almost always without an attorney. And then because of open meeting requirements, the three members of the board discuss it amongst themselves on mic and then make their decision on the fly while the person's standing there. It's as transparent as you might ever want. And in terms of achieving some goals, like allowing us to see how this works and humanizing these actors and exposing them to people they wouldn't see otherwise, it's good. There's other problems with the system, including the requirement that they all are unanimous in how they vote. That means that we're kind of middle of the road, middle of the pack in terms of productivity for clemency. But the transparency aspect, having seen it in real life and been to 7 or 8 of these hearings, I'm a real believer in it at this point.
Sean, I noticed. Oh, you had unmuted. Did you
I was going to say, I think transparency is really important in the process. I think it's also it's important for the individual who's being considered and their families as well. I think once you see someone in person or hear from someone's loved one, it's so much harder to turn away from that person. And it also in turn makes that person feel like they're being heard. So I had a clemency hearing in Illinois and for one of my clients. And when we went, we brought a picture of him to the prison review board. And I watched as the individuals on the other side stared at this picture the entire time I was talking. And, to me, that is important. It is important for us to be able to show up and say, here are our tools. And it makes it harder for them to look away. But on the other hand, now the part of the Illinois process that is less transparent is that we did all of that, but now we don't know what's going on with this petition. So it's sort of, it's not really an answer to your question, but it's more to demonstrate, that transparency is important. It makes you feel heard. It makes you feel like you have a way to participate in the process. But the lack of transparency is frustrating when you do all of the work to be heard to then not know what's going on.
Those are really great answers. And I want to use all of our time as best as we can. So I'm going to shift gears again to pick up a thread that several of you have mentioned, or I think maybe even all of you, about this idea of mass clemency. I think we have to see a tension in clemency between clemency as sentencing relief for individuals, often extraordinary individuals, and then also the examples of mass clemency, like for the Whiskey Rebellion or at the end of the Vietnam War. And so I'm wondering if someone wants to address what do you make of this shift, at least at the federal level, from a mass perspective on clemency or a more systemic perspective, at least at times, to an individualistic approach. And I know that that's not the approach that is necessarily applies everywhere in the states. And I'm wondering what you think about how these two visions of clemency, one about individuals and the other about structural injustices, relate to each other. And at a third or fourth question, what do you think are some of the prospects for mass clemency today, either at the state level or at the federal level?
So I think that one of the, when I think about one of the problems of mass clemency, I guess, and thinking about how it works with individuals. So with mass clemency, you're never going to have a political official who's going to grant mass clemency to someone who committed a quote unquote violent offense. But there are many people who at times committed were convicted of a quote unquote violent offense. And when you at an individual level can make a plea to someone about, to a political official about that person, you are more likely to succeed. So I actually think that they need to work together, right? Like I think mass clemencies are for something that's politically palatable, but individual clemencies are for something are critically important. And I know Jenny does a lot of this work. And some of the clients that I've had in Illinois are people who I don't think that politically they would, anyone would welcome a mass clemency for that type of conviction. But when you're able to tell someone's individual story to the governor, to the president, I think that's where, you have a chance at redemption, a chance at second chance, a chance to give them a second chance. So I think it's actually important that they work together and work off of each other.
There's a really good book that just came out by a guy named Graham Dodds, Mass Pardons in America. I wrote a review of it, which I'll post in the chat here. But part of what Dodds talks about is that when we've seen mass pardons, almost always it's been in the interest of national reconciliation. I've talked already about Ford and Carter, but there's a lot of other examples. The Whiskey Rebellion, the mass pardons of Mormons in the wake of the Civil War. There was, I think, 6 or 7 rounds of pardons, that were seeking reconciliation after those times of great conflict. That's very different than saying, oh, well, the January 6th insurrectionists should get it. But I do think on a whole, one motivation for engaging with clemency at the national scale is that the war on drugs was remarkably divisive, that it created the same kind of deep tragedy that we see resulting from a war with a foreign adversary, and that the need for healing and being intentional about healing through measures like clemency, not limited to clemency, but including clemency, can really be important.
We focused a lot on clemency and the granting of clemency, but of course, reentry and what happens after clemency is granted is just a key component at both the state and federal level. Mike, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what kind of systemic changes we can make or one-on-one changes we can make to improve the reentry experience and how we can advocate for those kinds of changes.
Sure. I first want to just fight back a little bit on the question and say that clemency is something that reentry is something that happens after clemency. My position is that you will never get clemency, at least at scale, without ensuring that there will be adequate reentry after clemency is actually executed. So I think making sure that there's adequate reentry in place beforehand is a necessary component prior to clemency. And that's been a strategy of ours in whether for executive or judges or prosecutors, whomever, they just want to know that there's a safe place to go. And by the way, it is good public policy, it is good public safety. And for my feelings, if my loved one was getting out of jail or prison, I really think that some sort of structured professional reentry program is best for the individual. Unfortunately, throughout the United States, we really don't have adequate reentry or any type of, it's a colloquial term now, but halfway house program, with the exception actually of the federal BOP. Federal BOP, I think, may be the only jurisdiction in the country that has, a formal halfway house program where for the last X number of months or year of your sentence, you actually spend time in a community and be able to work and get a job and reunite with your family and your community slowly, rather than being behind bars one day and then free the next. So I really support the federal residential reentry program, RRC. California has a smaller version of that called Community Reentry Program, which I think and hope we should expand. I think it is a way to help with second looks and clemency across the board to ensure the decision makers that there is a safe place for this person to go, again, to reduce the political liability, but also because I think it's good, it's win-win across the board. It's cheaper, it's safer, it's better. We really do need a sophisticated and robust reentry programs, halfway houses, reentry centers, or whatever you want to call them. I think that they should be residential for some period of time, like the federal system. And it's something that we've worked very hard for, because right now you're released from jail or prison for the most part. It's really binary. You're behind bars one day, you are free the next. You've been in jail or prison for sometimes a long period of time. Being able to readjust, just being able to, navigate a bus system or wash your hands under these sinks. It takes time to learn these things. I'm a huge supporter of really robust, strong reentry programs as to encourage second looks and clemency in particular.
Mark, did you have something like that?
Just I really admire the work Mike's done on reentry, and I completely agree about its importance. I mean, one thing that I've had the pleasure of doing is going and visiting some of the people that we got clemency, who got clemency with us. I never say we got them clemency, because they got themselves clemency. We told the story of the life they lived to get clemency. But it's seeing the obstacles that people face. It's really pretty overwhelming. And the fact that so many have succeeded despite those obstacles is an incredible achievement. I mean, the fact that we see such low rates of recidivism amongst people who received clemency, even with the trouble finding a job, the trouble finding stable housing, the trouble finding a support network that's not going to get defunded 3 months after you start using it. The resilience that I see in people who've re-entered is really remarkable. In fact, I that's something that I want my students to see and to understand is how hard that road is, but to celebrate the success that people have achieved despite those obstacles.
Shanna, did you have something you wanted
Yeah,
to
I just
add?
want to say one thing about reentry, and I think something that's really important about reentry and also gets back to this like perfect person clemency issue is that we have to be patient with reentry. And I think that's really hard for us to do, but it's so important because people are coming home and people make mistakes, things happen. And sometimes our reentry process is so punitive that, one mistake and you're back right where you were. So I think we need reentry systems that allow people some flexibility and some opportunity to reenter society in a way where we're not just going to slam the door on them for one thing that happens. And I know that, there's a lot of groups who are doing that work in Illinois and across the country. And I think that, it's a really important part of thinking about reentry.
All right, so I'm hoping that each of you can offer us 1 minute, just 1 minute, on something that you find hopeful about in the area of clemency, just to wrap this up. And in fact, it could just be reentry if that's what you want to say. Mark, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I think that everything goes in cycles. And there is going to come a time where we're going to elect someone who's going to see clemency as the soul of the Constitution, as something that is an integral part of their work, that is something that enlivens them rather than avoiding it. Part of producing that, it's partly our job, that we have to really push for this to be an issue when we elect someone. The last time there was a question asked at a debate about clemency was between Ford and Carter. Since then, it's been pretty much ignored. And that's partly on us that we haven't made it more of an issue when it matters most, which is when people are running for office.
Mike, you want to take this?
All right, I hijacked the screen just for a minute to share. I just thought of this based on the conversation about sharing stories and meeting people and hope. I posted this to Twitter yesterday. This is a picture of one of our clients who was freed through executive action. He's now a truck driver, and he saw snow for the first time. And here he is in his life. He served 25 years for nonviolent crime, and now he's out. And I think the most hopeful thing of all, and I'm not Kim Kardashian, but look, that's 160,000 likes. I mean, there are people out there who really support this work, this idea, the idea of redemption, and they want to see and meet these people and hear their stories. And I love those stories. I insist on all, I can't go and pick up every one of our clients who gets out, but getting those pictures and stories out, I think is super critical. I agree wholeheartedly with that effort. And I just also want to end, although my comments prior about clemency in general, you know how I feel, that I agree with Mark that this is required a massive effort on many fronts, and clemency is certainly an important tool.
Social media rarely makes me feel hopeful, but I think, as Mike was, sort of alluding to, social media actually makes me feel very hopeful with regards to clemency, because it really does demonstrate that people care about these stories, they care about these people, they just need to hear about them more, and that's where social media comes in. It is a tool that we can use to share these stories, and I think that's what exactly, that's what we're doing. That's what organizations like FAMM are doing. That's what other organizations and other advocates and lawyers are doing, and it's working. So that's something that makes me hopeful.
Well, thank you to Shanna, Mark, Mike. This was really a terrific panel. I learned a lot, and it's always I just love hearing from you and the work that you're doing.